Realm presents Tales Beyond Time, Episode 11.
Fellow travelers, well met and welcome back to Tales Beyond Time, presented by Realm. I'm your host, Marco Palmieri, here to guide you on another journey into the unexpected. This week we have something special for you, written by acclaimed author Kate Elliot. With a career going back to the early 90s, Kate has been a finalist for the Locus and World Fantasy Awards, as well as the Hugo, Nebula, and Andre Norton Awards. A master world builder, she's known for writing vivid stories about remarkable women, and today's tale is no exception. The Queen's Garden originally appeared in her 2015 collection, The Best of Kate Elliot from Tachyon Publications, and is narrated for Realm by Rachel Fulginiti. The story takes us into a fantasy world of court intrigue. As their father threatens to bring their matriarchal kingdom to ruin, twin princesses plot to take their rightful place. Gentle listeners, please enjoy The Queen's Garden.
Please sit down, the youngest girls in front, and the older on the pillows behind. Close the doors so no one is distracted by the blooms and by the sunbirds and peacocks in the garden. The only blooms I want to admire are your attentive faces. Now that I have lit the incense and we have said the prayers to our divine ancestress, I can begin. Listen carefully to what I am about to tell you. On the day their father, the king Karana Dayara, gravely insulted the envoys of a powerful emperor, his daughters Princess An and Princess Yara awoke from their complacency. In the years since their mother's death, they had allowed his affection to lull them into thinking all would go forward as it always had, down the generations, since the first queen, the Lady Rhinoceros, had established her sacred presence in the Queen's Garden. An and Yara sat on pillows on the balcony that had been built for their mother, Queen Karan, in the king's palace. The sisters were twins who shared everything equally, except that they were entirely different in stature and disposition. An had a cleft in her chin and the ability to listen to what was not being said. Yara was small of frame, and she kept her hair cut short so it would not ever fall in her eyes when she most needed to see. Through an elaborately carved teak panel, they watched the proceedings in the king's audience hall. Elevated upon a dais, the king, their father, sat on a gold brocade couch embroidered with male peacocks, parading in brilliant sprays of blue-green feathers, while drab peahens lingered half-hidden along the backs. "Goodness!" Yara exclaimed as she studied the startling scene unfolding below. "I knew our father could be volatile, but even I did not expect him to act so provocatively." An squinted, for her eyesight was as poor as her hearing was keen. When an emperor sends envoy to demand tribute from a king who is not already his vassal, he is expecting either to receive submission or to create a pretext for war. The three envoys knelt, arms held behind their backs by the king's soldiers. Blood splattered their silk robes. Their cries wove through the golden pillars that lined the hall. The fleshy knobs of two severed noses had come to rest on the marble floor. The third man's nose hung by a strip of skin. The captain of the guard calmly placed the three severed ears into a linen pouch. Threads of blood seeped through the cloth as he handed them to the king's sorcerers. The king's herald spoke on the king's behalf. "Let it be known to the Emperor of Sorrow that His Excellency Karana Dayara is master of the kingdom of Karan. Your master's impolite demand that our Holy Majesty bend his knee to a foreign king and pay him a vassal's tribute can only be met with refusal. Being merciful, the king has left you each your tongues, with which to carry these words back to your master, and each one ear to hear what answer your master may give you for the trouble you took to come here." The groaning envoys were dragged out, the one man's severed nose still flopping against his cheek. Two royal custodians hurried forward to clean up the blood with its offending tang. Incense was lit. The royal pig keeper took away the noses, for they were of little use to the sorcerers, not like the ears which could be tuned so the king could listen in on all conversations the envoys heard. The teak panels with their carvings of vines screened the sisters' sacred power away from the sight of foreign men. It also allowed the sisters to observe the king's clenched expression and fisted hands, without him knowing they were watching. "He has become too full of himself." Fine lines wrinkled Anne's delicate brow as she frowned. "Ever since Mother's death, he has forgotten to rule wisely as our regent, and instead rules pridefully. We should have seen it before it came to this." "But he is right to refuse to pay tribute," objected Yara. "Not so loud. That may be, but we cannot defeat the Emperor of Sorrow in open war. There are quieter ways to deflect the Emperor's interest. When the envoys return home, the Emperor is required to avenge the insult, or he will look weak to his own court. This will be the excuse he desires." Yara fidgeting and Anne pensive, the sisters watched their father gesture for the next supplicant to come forward. The king's color was heightened, and his back straight with energy and tension, or so Yara described him to Anne. The mutilation had put him in a good mood, and with a generous smile he welcomed each new group of visitors come to pay their respects. A consortium of merchants sought royal permission to open up an exchange with the port of Emerald Island, and they had brought the fifth son of the Emerald Prince to assist them in negotiations, together with a substantial offering for the temple. A prince from the upland province of Golden Hill had sent his third son to be admitted to the royal guards. Envoys from the Ruby Baron, the king's distant cousin and former rival for their mother's preference in marriage, brought bolts of lambent silk and waterfalls of jewelry wrought of gold and gems, to remind their father that the king had daughters of an age to be married, and the baron had sons of an age to marry them. Pearls hung from the bottom of the curtain that separated the balcony from the corridor. They clacked softly as Lady Norena, supervisor of the court kitchens, swept the outer curtain aside and entered the balcony, a privilege she had earned through years of tireless service. She sat on her heels on the far side of the inner curtain, whose translucent silk did not hide the towering beaded headdress she wore as a mark of her importance in the royal household. "Your Graces," she said, "what of the matter of the banquet we have prepared for the envoys of the Emperor of Sorrow?" "Let the food be distributed at the hospital," said Anne. "Princess Yara and I will dine in private with the king our father." "But with less variety than the pig savor today," said Yara. Lady Norena coughed once, hand covering her smile, but when she lowered her hand her expression turned somber. "There will be trouble in the provinces when the princes and barons and lords hear the king has insulted an emperor. Sorrow will now send a fleet to castigate the man responsible for such disrespect. The sword will fall on everyone in the kingdom, not just on one man's pride." "This has occurred to us as well." Anne touched a finger to her own lips. "Have you some recommendation?" "Go to the palace of the ancestors and pray to the Lady Rhinoceros for guidance, and to your mother and grandmother, who still have wisdom to impart. But if I may, let me be given permission to recover the noses from the pig keepers." Yara raised an eyebrow to show interest, but Lady Norena offered no further morsel. Anne slipped an oblong gold bead stamped with the royal horn of the ancestress from one of her braids and handed it over to the lady. "Do what you believe to be prudent. We will call you when we need you." Lady Norena withdrew. With her went the scent of musk and flowers she wore, dusted into her ornately knotted clothing. Yara sneezed, sniffed, and wiped her eyes. "We could invite the invaders to a banquet and poison them," she said, with a hopeful lift of her eyebrows. "Poison leaves a tainted trail. We must find a path that avoids war before it is too late to turn the conflict aside." Below, the king departed with his guards and custodians and sorcerers. Afterward, the courtiers, supplicants, and visitors lined up in a complicated pattern, according to ancestral rank, to take their leave through the far doors. Yara had leisure to study their faces and describe them in detail to An, since no man could turn his back on the king's couch, even if the king was not seated in it. There were tall men and short men, stocky men and slender men wearing the long, wrapped skirts and embroidered jackets of the Fire Islands, and men garbed in the flamboyant robes or sober tunics of far-off lands. The prince's son from the Emerald Islands had a pleasing face and a ready smile, Yara said, which An pronounced suspicious. The prince's son from Golden Hill wore the somber expression and neat garments appropriate to a warrior, which An thought proper, but perhaps meant the man was hiding something. Among the envoys from the Ruby Baron stood a young man remarkable for the scar on his neck, the embroidered sunbird on his tunic, and the turquoise stone embedded in the socket of his right eye. This meant, An said, that he was worth watching for a hint of his true purpose at court. Many men lived in the land of Karan, whose territories had been strung together like so many beads into a headdress, through the efforts of King Karanadayara. Their father had built upon the wealth and authority that Queen Karan had bestowed on him when she had married him in their youth. Merchants beholden to his fleet for protection from pirates enriched his treasury with the taxes they paid for the privilege of trading. Many were his cousin princes and rival chiefs, and none loved him, for he had bound many once independent principalities and baronies into the folds of his royal garment. But they obeyed him and paid tribute, just as the distant Emperor of Sorrow was now demanding obeisance from him. After 25 years as preeminent king in the Fire Islands, he was not about to bow down before another man. He was still vigorous enough to prosecute any war he pleased, and would do so without regard to what it cost the people he ruled. An scooted closer to the balcony railing and gripped it, to push herself up onto her withered legs. War will bring nothing but ruin on the land. We must prevent it. Yara tucked a crutch under her sister's arm and gave her an arm to lean on. I think you already have an idea. Perhaps I do, but we cannot proceed without asking for the blessing of the queens who came before us. A note written on a scarf of floral silk awaited them in their private rooms. The letters were brushed by a masterful hand in the form a man uses when he gifts poetry and fine cloth to a woman he is courting. In the king's garden, 2 kiss of elegance flowers bloom, but there is no sunbird to harvest their nectar. Yara laughed so hard that she cried, and afterward dabbed tears from her cheeks with one corner of the scarf. I would be ashamed to write something so baldly obvious. He even wore the mark of the sunbird on his clothing, as if he feared we might miss his meaning. As a marriage proposal, it lacks subtlety and refinement. An pulled the silk from her sister's fingers and examined the brushstrokes. The man who wrote this is too ambitious, or his opinion of us is too low. Furthermore, I would never marry a man who makes such a crude and insulting error, added Yara. It is not the king's garden. It is the queen's garden. We do not need to marry him to make use of him. We must discover where his ambitions lead him. A fleet of devoted women served the queen's garden, then as now, some of them kinswomen and some loyal attendants. An called for their chief chatelaine. She was their deceased mother's much older sister, born without the queen's mark, and thus free to live outside the palace in her youth. In widowhood she had returned to live in the palace. Because of her wisdom and age, it was she who knew if a blade of grass was blown under any door in the palace, or if a glance was shared between hopeful lovers or budding rivals. It took some time for the woman to appear, striding in from outside with her sleeves fluttering. Her decades of travel and diplomacy had given her a brisk, confident manner, although her skin was quite weathered from sun and wind and sea. "Who brought this, Lady Aunt?" Anne asked. Lady Aunt examined the scarf, spoke to several of her own attendants, then nodded. "A courier from the guest wing, Your Excellencies. I had him followed. His master is called Prince Genli." "One of the sons of our father's cousin, the Ruby Baron?" "The eldest son. He has won renown in several sea battles against the sea pirates who plague the North Strait. He lost an eye in battle and replaced it with an ensorcelled piece of turquoise. It is said he can see the movements of enemy ships in the stone, and thus can never be ambushed or surprised." "Prince Genli is an ambitious man," Yara remarked. Lady Aunt nodded. "A trifle too ambitious, we may surmise. Yet it is known his family's holdings are poverty-stricken and shabby. It is rumored he seeks to restore the family fortunes." Anne smoothed the scarf along the table. The unmarked side of the cloth promised a fallow field for words, should she wish to sow them there. Before she wrote, she addressed her aunt again. "Lady Aunt, what do you know of the son of the Prince of Golden Hill?" Lady Aunt gestured for the young attendants to go out to fetch tea and rice balls baked with coconut milk, bean curd in a sweet ginger sauce, and dumplings. She walked a circuit of the spacious chamber where the princesses, their attendants, aunts, cousins, and friends often spent evenings playing chess and reciting poems. One side of the room was open to the Queen's garden, where Kiss of Elegance bobbed in a breeze and streamers of purple sky blaze hung in curtain-like sheets from trellises. When Lady Aunt was sure no one could possibly overhear, she returned to the princesses. "I was just now hurrying to speak privately with you on this very matter, for I have heard the most unexpected news. The third son of the Prince of Golden Hill is called Lord Keeney. I have it on good authority that, when a boy, Lord Keeney was betrothed to Lady Nastua. She is the second daughter of the neighboring Seven Falls Principality, which is the mountain land ruled by the descendants of Lady Snake. The auspicious days for the wedding had been set years ago, but I have just heard the marriage is to be set aside, because your father, the king, has decided to take the young woman to wife instead." These tidings reduced both sisters to speechlessness. For a while there was silence, but for a hummingbird flitting among the sky blaze, wings ablur. "Father means to marry again," exclaimed Yara at last, grasping Anne's hands in hers. "We heard no whisper of his intention here in the Queen's garden. All these years he has properly contented himself with concubines. What can it mean?" Lady Aunt had a smile that stung more the brighter it got. "Your father saw a portrait of the girl and desired her. He claims it is as simple as that." "Nothing with our father is simple," said Anne slowly. "Now it seems his desire is inflamed in more than matters of war and trade. Perhaps his cook is spicing his food too heatedly." "Do not forget that in my younger years I traveled all over the Fire Islands as ambassador for your mother the Queen," said Lady Aunt. Not that anyone could forget it, for she still wore her hair in the simple style of fisherwomen and trade widows, never adorned with beads and towering headdresses. "It was I who interviewed and negotiated for a husband for her. Remember that your father comes from an island where the king is succeeded by his favored son." "Are 2 daughters born with the Queen's mark not riches enough for him?" Yara cried. "Can he believe any son could replace us?" Lady Aunt tapped 2 fingers to her own lips to remind Yara to keep her voice low. "No daughter can replace you who does not come from the lineage of the Lady Rhinoceros. Yet an ambitious man may forget the proper order of life and the honor of the ancestors in favor of greed and pride. He was a good husband to your mother, but he has changed since she passed into the palace of the ancestors." Yara shifted restlessly on her pillow. not knowing what to say. Anne's gaze was fixed on a hazy distance only she could see. "I would like to know what manner of match it was for Lord Keeney and Lady Nasua. What have you heard, Lady Aunt? Are they glad to be free of the marriage? Indifferent? Resigned?" "The match was arranged in the usual manner when both were children. It is in all ways an unexceptional alliance between neighboring principalities. A third son and a daughter who lacks her divine ancestress's royal mark. Rumor has a sharper tongue, however. She tells me that, over the years, the two were allowed to spend a great deal of time together, and have come to genuinely love each other. My informants whisper that when your father the king's decision was made known to them, both objected passionately to any suggestion they must dissolve the match. That your father has kept his intentions a secret cannot bode well. Likewise, he is the one who demanded Lord Keeney be brought to the palace and sealed into life service in his army. A handy way to be rid of the young man, if you ask me." Yara leaped to her feet, taking a turn around the pillows on which she and Anne sat. "Is it not cruel to ask Lord Keeney to serve in the palace guard and watch the woman he loves be paraded as queen in front of him?" The royal bell rang, announcing their father's approach. Yara flung herself back on the pillows, hastily tidying the strings of beads in her headdress that had gotten tangled during her outburst. Lady Aunt calmly rang her handbell to summon the servants, but she continued speaking in a low voice. "Lord Keeney will be sent on campaign, not kept in the palace. Before this new trouble with the Saroese, your father has been talking of nothing except his desire to expand his influence yet farther." "He wants to bring more ports under his sway," said Anne. Lady Aunt nodded. "You can be sure the independent islands are aware of this and have sent their own informants to court to sniff out his plans. You saw the envoy from the Emerald Islands. His name is Lord Varai, the fifth son of the Emerald Prince. He came in the company of the merchants, but I think he is not here to assist them in bargaining for trade rights." "The carelessly smiling man," said Yara, with a laugh, for she was not one to dwell on bad news for more than a few breaths. "Hard not to notice him. I described him at great length to Anne, and I am sure she asked me to repeat myself several times." Anne's frown made Yara giggle again. "A man who smiles too much may be slow-witted, careless, bored, or too enamored of himself," Anne said, in a tart voice quite unlike her usual fathomless, cool demeanor. "Write Lord Varai a note," advised Lady Aunt as she craned her neck to see if the king's attendants had yet appeared on the garden walkway to announce the king. "I believe your father intends to conquer Emerald Island to get control of its red-leaf plantations. Perhaps the Emerald Prince suspects and has sent his son to determine what risk his people face. Or perhaps the young man is here for some other reason, one his father, the prince, knows nothing about. Now, tuck your secrets away into the folds of your garments and speak of safer topics." Footsteps approached along the garden walkway. Lady Aunt rang the handbell again, and their ladies hurried back into the airy chamber to sort seating pillows and clear tables strewn with books and chess pieces. The doors to the inner walkway were opened. Their father the king strode in, having shed his audience robes and now wearing a lustrous silk robe of wave-churned blue, embroidered with fiery phoenixes burning up out of the white ocean foam. He sat on the pillow reserved for him, which had been placed on a mat by the balcony so he could enjoy a lovely view over the orchids. Anne quickly settled beside him because he did not like to see her struggle to walk. While everyone else retired to a respectful distance, Yara took charge of the tray of delicacies and poured the tea. He lifted the cup to inhale the heady scent of ginger and peach. He had great dignity of presence, but the disturbing intensity of his manner betrayed a man made restless by a constant storm surging within. At first he had a great deal to say about the Emperor of Sorrow's attempt to insult him, and why it had required him to react as he did, lest he be diminished in the eyes of the men at court, and indeed the world at large. He spoke at length, and neither of his daughters interrupted him. After a while he paused to eat a dumpling and drink more tea. "Your Excellency," said An, "perhaps you have considered what trouble may be brought down upon a peaceful land." He set down his cup quite emphatically. "You are still a child, daughter. This is the king's duty. It must be left to the king to act." An's eyes fluttered in a way Yara recognized as the heat of her anger, fanning imprudent words that Yara knew must be left unspoken. She slid the platter of aromatic bean curd with its ginger slices directly in front of the king, distracting him, while with her other hand she pinched An into silence. "Is there some news you bring, Your Excellency?" Yara asked in a voice so bright it lightened the chamber. "How eager you look!" His gaze held a smile that saw not them, but a brilliantly feathered dream invisible to all others. When he told them the news they already knew, they clapped their hands and pretended surprise. Yara plied him with more dumplings, smiling fixedly. "What wonderful news, Your Excellency! I have long harbored the most heartfelt desire to welcome a new woman into the palace, for I miss my mother quite sorely." "How soon may this longed-for arrangement come to pass?" added An, in a tone only half as sour as she felt, but her father did not notice the way she blinked too much, and meanwhile crushed a rice ball flat with the bottom of her spoon. The priests, he informed them, were even now calculating the matter, seeking the most beneficent days to hold the wedding festivities. Because Lady Nasua was born into a different divine lineage than that of Lady Rhinoceros, the temple must show exceptional attention to the phase of the moon and the rising time of certain stars. Yara poured more tea. He was not a man inclined to dwell on any matter for long, once it was decided. An had at last recovered enough to be able to delicately direct their conversation down more amicable channels. He wanted to know how the tapestries commemorating his victory 3 years ago over the Golden Hill Principality were coming along in the weaving hall. Had they received the silk thread he had sent them from his recent expedition to the west? Were the colors and patterns acceptable? How did the Royal Hospital fare? An detailed her work administering the Royal Hospital she had founded. He listened attentively, as he always did. Afterwards, she and her father played a game of walls, which was sadly interrupted before its conclusion by a message calling the king to meet with his council over the matter of the Saroese ambassadors whose ship had departed with the turning tide. The messenger was one of the women of his household, an elderly woman who had served in the palace since she was a child. "Your Excellency, the royal sorcerers have sent me to tell you that the ears have begun whispering." An and Yara leaned forward, eager to hear more, but the king merely glanced at his daughters and then departed with his attendants, exactly as he would have done when they were small. When he had gone and the room cleared of all trace of his presence, Yara said, "He would have discussed the matter with our mother. The sorcerers would have been brought to the Queen's audience hall so she could hear their words. With his own words, he treats us as if we are still children. Can it be our father does not honor us as he ought?" An considered the red and gold sprays of flowers, which to her appeared more as smears of color than petals and leaves. "At any time within the past 3 years, we have been of proper age to be anointed as queen. Yet he has never once encouraged the temple to inquire as to an auspicious festival for our ascension. Why have we been content to remain as princesses, rather than ascend to our rightful place? He is a responsible administrator and a bold commander. Under his regency, the land has prospered. If the Saroese invade, it will go ill for the people and the land. As for you and me, Yara, who can say what will become of us if that happens? It is a dreadful thing to consider. If I were the Emperor of Sorrow, I would delegate a prince to marry us, and thus hold the land in our name. If the Saroese care for the ancestors at all, which we cannot be sure they do, retorted An grimly, for I have had a worse thought. Yara bent closer to hear. What could be worse than a Saroese invasion? The noble women of the hill country hold their power through their holy foremothers, just as we do. What if our father means to bury the sacred relics of the Lady Rhinoceros and erect a temple to a new ancestress, to replace our lineage with that of his new queen? Yara's hiss startled a cat, just then curling up to nap on the king's pillow. The animal bolted outside to vanish among the blooms. "This will not do," Yara said in a hard tone. "No, indeed it will not. It makes a person wonder if he has more than one kind of desire on his mind when he seeks a new bride. Perhaps he seeks to overthrow the power of the Lady Rhinoceros, or of the divine ancestresses altogether. For if a new queen is beholden to him for her power, then he may believe the land is his, and not in her keeping. What do we do, An? We have allowed our affection for our father the king to lull us into a false peace. It has been so comfortable to go on in this way. It is true we have shirked our duty, Yara said, with a lightning frown. However much we may suffer, the land will suffer more. We must act, An. Sorrow had drained the light from An's face, but now she straightened her shoulders and gestured for an attendant to set out her writing desk. We discover what allies and weapons we have. The robe of our plan must be seamless. Fetch out the new inkstone. With a needle, she pricked her finger and Yara's, and with 2 drops of blood mixed a blue-black ink on the untouched stone. Because An had an especially graceful hand, despite her poor vision, she wrote the notes. In answer to Prince Agenli, she wrote, "A bath of salt water kills flowers, but a bejeweled fish may carve the seas at will." Are you sure that is not too obvious? Yara puffed light breaths onto the wet ink to hasten its drying as it set into the weave. He must be answered in the same manner he wrote. A man of his temperament will expect such unsubtle treatment. I am willing to offer him what he truly wants, which I do not believe is marriage to us. To Lord Keeney she wrote, "The kite will fly higher with a longer string." Very good, agreed Yara. If Lord Keeney wishes to be free of his betrothal, or honestly desires Lady Nasua to gain a nobler station in life than marriage to him, then we cannot rely on his aid. To Lord Varai she wrote, "The banquet table." Goodness, that is elusive even for you, An, said Yara, as she slipped the messages into silver tubes inscribed to look like bamboo. Even I am not sure what you mean by it. What the man makes of it will tell us what we need to know about him. They gave the messages into the hands of trusted ladies and sent them off. Because An and Yara wore the mark of the Queen, they were too sacred and holy to walk about in the world like ordinary people. A queen's faithful sisters and cousins and aunts and nieces and ladies act as her hands and ears and eyes to the world outside the palace complex, while the man she marries acts as her spear and public voice. A queen's responsibilities are legion, for it is her duty to see that the land and the people flourish. Thus, after their afternoon devotions at the temple, Yara spent the last of the day's light weaving at her loom among the other women in the royal weaving hall, because every notable event was commemorated with garlanded tapestries. Meanwhile, An stripped out of her finery and, wearing humbler garb, was carried to the hospital she had founded. The hospital lay at the edge of the vast palace grounds, reached by crossing 3 bridges, traversing 2 orchards, and passing alongside the reed-skirted western lake with its waterfowl and fish. The hospital building was of An's design, a long building built of wood with raised floors to keep damp and bugs and snakes and scorpions away. All the male patients were housed at one end, women at the other, and children in their own dormitory, amid the fragrant medicinal herb garden. Ann's eyes were weak, but she had discovered that if she touched a person and listened with her ears and her heart, and the caring that dwelt in the pit of her belly, she could hear something about their illness. From palace doctors and city surgeons and village healers she encouraged to come speak to her, she continued to learn. More importantly, in the hospital she could bring the people to her, and thus the garden of their fears and hopes was opened to her. Now, sitting in the children's dormitory beside a slack-faced child shivering with fever, she heard the bubbling strain of lungs filling with liquid. She was listening so intently to the child's labored breathing, she did not at first notice a rumble of footsteps at the entrance, not until they ceased, and a pleasing male voice murmured, as to a guide, "Who is that lovely young woman?" She looked up to see a smear of bright colors at the other end of the long dormitory room, sky blues and palm greens, with splashes of sun yellow and searing orange. A company of foreign men had come to tour the hospital. Visitors to the kingdom often did, for the palace hospital was already famous for being open to any person who needed care. Her sight was too weak to make out distant faces, but she felt their gazes on her. Most moved away politely, but one man took several steps closer to her. His gaze she felt as a pressure on her face. If smiles were fragrance, then his bloomed as with flowers. Would a man be so rude as to smile at a noblewoman he could not know and ought not converse with? Or did she, in her brown hospital robe, worn to conceal stains, appear as something else entirely, an ordinary woman whom a charming man might gently flirt with? She blushed. Just as he took in a breath to speak, the guide hurried back to fetch him. "My lord, if you please, the party has moved on to the next building. It is not permitted to remain behind." "Is it not? For I have questions that only an intelligent person who knows this place intimately might answer." Because he was still looking at her as he spoke, in exactly the sort of laughing voice Anne found most suspicious, she blushed more deeply. Yet she refused to avert her face as she ought, as he cast a last glance toward her and finally followed the rest out. Trembling a little, she gave instructions to ply the sick child with cold baths and a tisane of firebane. In the curtained carriage on their way back to the Queen's garden, she asked her attendants what party of visitors had trampled so discourteously through the hospital. "The delegation from the Emerald Island, Your Excellency. Everyone on the staff was talking about it. There was a prince with them, a pleasing manner of man, so everyone said. He asked a great many questions about how the hospital was established and if its presence in the city had reduced the incidence of disease." Anne's annoyance boiled, and she had to fan herself to cool down her cheeks. For the worst of it was that she had been pleased by the man complimenting her intelligence. She had to wonder if he had guessed who she really was. The carriage rolled to a stop beneath the sprawling canopy of the sacred fig tree that stood outside the double gates leading into the Queen's garden. Lady Ant clambered into the carriage and signaled for the attendants to disembark to give them privacy. As the oxen started up again, she spoke so as not to be heard above the rumble of wheels on stone. "I have yet more news which the king has attempted to keep from me. The Saroese know nothing of our sorcery, so they speak freely among themselves. The commander of the ship that carries the envoys back to the fleet has praised the envoys' courage in provoking the king to this degree of insult. To create a pretext for invasion was their intention all along. Once they return to the emperor's court, it is expected that the emperor will order a fleet to sail here, overthrow King Karana Dayara on the grounds of scorning and insulting the empire's envoys who arrived under the banner of peaceful diplomacy, and take the kingdom for himself. An held the beaded curtain away from the window and let the fragrance of the garden kiss her face. The blur of trees was overladen with the depthless blue of a shadowless sky. Perhaps until that moment she had hoped for a different outcome. But if her father was concealing even this news from them, then she knew they had to proceed. "Let us go to the weaving hall," she said at last. Lady Aunt nodded, making no further comment. In the royal weaving hall, An left her aunt in the carriage. Yara sat apart from the main weaving hall on a span of floor where the afternoon light spilled gold over the loom, with its warp and weft, but left Yara seated in shadow beneath the high beams of the roof. The weight of the sun faded the cloth even as she wove it, but display was never her purpose, nor was her weaving ever finished. She rose from her stool and hurried over so that An should not have to limp across the expanse of polished plank floor on which her crutch might slip. An took her hands. The memory of the blurred colors in the hospital, the gaudy clothes, the brilliant presents, still made her tremble. Not even the garden's expansive grounds and the song of wind in the branches had wiped away that memory. "How does your work go?" she asked, hearing a quaver in her own voice. "It will serve our purpose, if we are truly determined on this end." "We must be," said An, and told her what Lady Aunt had discovered. "To do anything else would dishonor the queens who came before us." With a sigh of resignation, followed by a deep inhalation for resolve, Yara agreed. That evening they called Lady Norena and Lady Aunt to their garden room. Once the women were settled for a game of four-handed dice, the princesses set their ladies to singing a long excerpt from the opera of the Phoenix-haunted ship. The robust choruses and effortful arias drowned out the players' soft voices. Lady Norena placed first stakes of a single ivory comb on the table. "Did you acquire the noses?" Yara asked in a whisper. Norena rolled the bone dice. The four sides came up as 2 cups, the sign of boundless abundance, a mortar and pestle, and a ship. She touched each one with the tip of a finger. "This is a throw appropriate for the supervisor of the kitchens, do you not think? Properly dried, a nose can be ground to powder with a specially treated mortar and pestle. Food flavored with this condiment will cause the one who eats it to have his desire heightened for that which smells best to him." "Ah," said Yara. An reached for the dice. "Perhaps I may send you red leaf powder to flavor this meal as well. It is very expensive, which is why we use it at the hospital only for the most sickly cases, to thicken weak blood. But it is also known to thicken a man's desire." "That will inflame his desire, truly," remarked Norena. "But the dish must also be spiced with a kingly savor to encourage his other lusts." An slid a gold bracelet off her royal arm and pushed it under the low table. "Flakes of gold touched by royal skin." Norena tucked the bracelet into one of the ornate knots of her wrapped dress. After placing a stake of 2 silver brooches on the table, An shook out the dice for her own play. They fell as a calligraphy brush, a mortar and pestle, a stalk of rice, and a knife. "You are a predictable person," observed Yara, with a flicker of the eyelids that made her seem ready to laugh. "Each of these represents an aspect of your work at the hospital. Also, 2 cups defeats your 1 knife, so Lady Norena defeats you." Lady Aunt placed 3 silver sticks shaped as bamboo on the table as her stake. As the old woman carefully weighed each of the 8-sided dice to measure how much power burned in them, An slipped a curled strip of rice paper from each of the ornate silver tubes Lady Aunt had just set down. On the first paper, Lord Agenley had written, "The sea wind knows no walls. The waves are its bride." "As I hoped," said An, nodding. "He will take our offer. He is more interested in his own quest than in our garden. Lord Keeney had written, "Past the Wear lies the empty pond, gilded in sunlight." "He means the fish will be trapped in a golden cage that offers no sustenance or companionship," murmured Anne. "The mountain bride does not desire to become queen." Yara looked pensive, studying Lord Keeney's formal hand, which was correct in all its curves and angles, but too precise to be beautiful. "The man's passion is not for brushwork, but his metaphor is good. More importantly, I believe his heart will be willing to do what needs to be done. Yet all turns on this last." Her hands had begun trembling, as they did when her thoughts became agitated, and so she had to nudge the last paper to her sister. Yara unrolled the last message, read it quickly, then silently passed the note to Anne. Lord Varai had written in a hand as elegant as Anne's lovely script. The letters wore the crowns and curlicues customary to the more elaborate writing style of Emerald Island, almost too decorative, yet on the page he made it joyful, like a laughing smile. He had written, "A man savors the first 2 fish brought to his table and eats his fill of them. The rest he throws to the pigs." Anne frowned, and Yara read the note again. "Is he calling us fish?" Yara whispered. Lady Ant picked up the dice. "I interpret the message otherwise. He is speaking of sons, not daughters. A 5th son holds little interest for a prince already surfeited with healthy boys. Such a prince may even have tried to kill or exile the extra boys to protect the ones he favors, so there is no struggle for succession. It is no wonder a 5th son travels with humble merchants, for like best quality silk, he may be worth a good price to the right buyer, or he may simply have escaped an untenable situation." She rolled the dice with so much force they slammed into the silver sticks, flipping to rest with a wheel, a ship, and 2 knives on display. "2 knives defeat 2 cups," said Lady Ant with a triumphant smile. She flashed a teasing glance at Yara as she reached out as if to collect her winnings. Yara affectionately tapped Lady Ant's arm with a closed fan. "Not so fast, for I have not yet played." She set out her own stake of 4 silver bracelets. She scooped up the dice, shook them in her cupped hand as she murmured a charm under her breath, smiled at the other 3 women, and tossed. The bone pieces clattered over the table and came to rest. 4 knives. "That looks ominous, does it not? Every blade will meet its target." With a lazy smile, Yara swept in her earnings. Over on the cushions where the ladies played flutes and lutes, a woman was singing the lament of the dying phoenix as it melted into sea foam and dissolved into the ocean. "I am sorry for it, but he has driven us down this road by his own choices," said Anne, wiping away a tear. "Let me write answers to each man using the same inkstone. Then we must shatter the stone into pieces and seed the fragments into the garden gravel. After that, we will pull apart the brush and feed each separate hair to a separate fire. We must be careful to be sure the king's sorcerers cannot possibly steal from stone or brush the truth of what we wrote and planned." To Prince Agenli, she sent nothing except a small seal, its stamp depicting the royal horn of their ancient ancestress, who was both a woman and a rhinoceros. To Lord Keeney she wrote, "The bird will fly home if its tether comes unleashed." To Lord Varai she wrote, "A subtle dish graces the banquet table." So it was done. That night, Lord Keeney escaped the palace barracks with his face concealed beneath a veil. A string of remounts gave him speed toward the mountains. The next morning, unaware that his hostage had absconded, the king ate his dawn soup of rice, fowl, cilantro, and pepper, cooked to its usual perfection in the royal kitchen, tended by Lady Norena's gracious expertise. Afterward, nose twitching, He expressed an urgent desire to ride at once to Seven Falls to collect his bride. Because much of his army had already been mustered to march to the coast, where they would set up defenses against the expected invasion from the Empire of Sorrow, he took only the palace guard as escort. 3 days later, at the turn of the tide, Prince Agenli departed in his sunbird-haunted ship, bearing the seal of the noble lineage of the Lady Rhinoceros. The sisters waited, watching. In the warp and weft of the loom, a vision unfolded, for Yara had woven the eyes of peacock's feathers into her threads. With this magic they could see across the whole of the land that prospered under the protection of their sacred ancestress. The king's company leaves behind the dense green farmlands and golden temples of the lowland and rides up into the mist-shrouded mountains. As the road steepens, the company straggles out into a long line, the winged lancers in the vanguard with their rainbow banners flooding the air with streaming color, and the night guard bringing up the rear in their rich indigo uniforms, sewn with an ornamentation of silver vines. The king himself is carried in an elaborately carved litter whose roof and curtains are sewn of many layers of gold and purple silk, so that like wings they seem to fold and unfold with each step. Soon the company slows to a crawl as it picks its way up toward a cloud-capped pass along a narrow valley surrounded by steep hills. Suddenly, rocks tumble and crash down onto the road. Earthquakes are common here in the Fire Islands, not that anyone felt a tremor this day. When the rumble subsides and the dust settles, the survivors scramble to claw twisted bodies out of the rubble. The rocks have split the party into 2 groups, one before and one behind the new barrier. In the ensuing confusion, men and women wearing the stripes of forest cats and the dappled skin of mountain wolves rush as if out of the rock itself, although in truth it is just that armed people had secreted themselves in caves and brush-hidden overhangs to carry out their ambush. The men carrying the king's litter fall as their group is overrun. A woman, armed with a bow and painted all green in the manner of a whip snake, steps onto the road. It is her arrow that pierces the king's eye as he stumbles out of silken draperies, and it is Lord Keeney's knife that finishes their father off. The soldiers who surrender are allowed to live and are sent back to the lowlands, with the king's body wrapped in the silk he died in. With the rockfall still blocking the road behind them, the mountain people stride up into the mist and rain of their ancestral home. The woman wearing the snake's aspect pauses before she departs. She looks up into the sky, as if she can see the brilliant feathered eyes that see all. Around her neck, she wears the token of her ancestress, a gold neck ring, bearing the face and tail of the whip snake. With a green hand she makes the sign of peace, and then Lady Nasua follows the others out of sight, into the rugged, wild slopes. An wept when Yara released her hand. Dust motes sank through strands of light. The rustle and chatter of women in the adjoining weaving hall drifted in to ease the silence. "I love him because our mother loved him, and because he treasured us," An said. "But this is our land, not his." Yara shed no tears. Unraveling the pattern took her the rest of the day, while An made her usual rounds at the hospital, her tears watering every sufferer she attended. In the sorcerer's garden, the ears whispered the words spoken aboard the Sorrowe's ship as it flew over the waves on its way to the Emperor's harbor far to the south. "King Karana Dayara will pay personally for his insult to the Emperor. Afterward, the riches of the kingdom of Karan will belong to the Empire." 3 days later, the remnants of the palace guard returned bearing the king's body. The day after King Karana Dayara's funeral, Lord Varai tossed the first torch onto the roof of the palace, founded and built by the deceased king in the first years of his reign. The entire court watched from afar as the palace burned to the ground, all the while placing bets on which chambers and structures would collapse in first. Before the ashes had cooled, the sisters married Lord Varai in a quiet ceremony. In this way, the least of the sons of the Emerald Prince became King Anavarai by means of his marriage. An ceased speaking ill of his smiles when she discovered he indeed had a particular interest in the hospital because his mother was a mountain woman who had taught him her healing lore. That he truly thought her lovely was no small inducement, even if she pretended otherwise. Yara encouraged their attachment. She had her own paramours among her ladies, and loved the king well enough in her own way. After the burning, the new king commanded the royal architects to measure out the grounds of a new king's palace upstream, past the third bridge, and thereby close to the royal hospital. Breaking with tradition, he asked for Queen Anne's input, because she had some ideas about better plumbing and running water that she wished to put into practice. Gifts were delivered from Lord Keeney and his mountain bride, a bow and arrows for Yara, and for Anne a set of bat-haunted calligraphy brushes, made with hog, badger, civet, mongoose, and weasel hair. The new king received an ally's knife, with an ivory hilt and a blade engraved with promises. Some weeks later, the king's sorcerers brought the whispering ears before the king and queens in a temporary hall hung with tapestries and roofed with palm fronds. The envoys had reached the imperial court of sorrow. They all listened as the emperor swore that with a mighty fleet he would avenge the insult and punish the impertinence of King Karana Dayara by invading the kingdom of Karan. So they prepared. Thus it happened that half a year later, when the winds shifted front to back in their usual pattern, the Sorrowese fleet sailed with its golden sails and gull-haunted ships across the Fire Sea and up the river to the new palace. King Anyara Varai sat clothed in gold and purple on the peacock couch in the king's audience hall. He received the invaders with an easy smile. Queen Anne and Queen Yara watched from the queen's balcony as three men strode forward in the manner of conquerors. A Sorrowese general clad in silver gray, a Sorrowese admiral marked by the badge of the sea-swift gull, and a Sorrowese ambassador with his hair plaited into 3 tiers. "We are come to chastise King Karana Dayara and the kingdom of Karan, which he rules," announced the ambassador. "King Karana Dayara is required to make personal restitution for the insult he gave to the Emperor of Sorrow." The king acknowledged the ambassador's heavy words with a gracious wave of his purple and gold silk scarves. "Then you have journeyed a long distance to the wrong place. For this is the kingdom of Anyara, not Karan. King Karana Dayara is dead, most grievously murdered by his enemies. Indeed, his palace was burned at the order of a prince of the Emerald Island. What an outrage that you have come so far to find that others have taken your righteous act of justice away from you. How can I aid you?" Trapped by their own words, the envoys felt obliged to join in an uneasy friendship with a man who presented himself as their new ally. They drank with the king at a banquet prepared by Lady Norena. Inspired by the feast, they swore vengeance on those who had stolen their revenge. Vengeance first, whatever they might secretly plan about invading this rich land afterward. The Sorrowese fleet set sail. Out on the Fire Sea, Prince Genli saw them coming with the magic he held in his turquoise eye. After the Sorrowese fleet had sacked the Emerald Island, Prince Genli used the gusting winds and his knowledge of the shoals to drive their ships onto the rocks near the coast. Then, having been given permission by the Queen's seal to take what he wanted from those ships he defeated, he pillaged the Sorrowese fleet and became wealthy enough to restore his family's holdings. So it was that the kingdom of Anyara prospered, at peace. In time, a daughter named Rhea was born with the queen's mark on her breast. It is Queen Rhea who now dwells in the queen's garden, the sacred heart of the land, while I, her sister, have traveled all these years as her ambassador, and am now returned to guide you, all you girls of the palace, as you come into your womanhood. This story is the first and most important lesson I teach you. The Lady Rhinoceros understood the dangers her daughters and their descendants would face. The Queen's garden is open to any we invite in, and it is a garden well worth sharing, but it belongs to us. Never forget it. It belongs to you.
Such a great story. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Ready for more incredible adventures? You might like Born to the Blade, in which two young blade crafters vie for power and their very survival in a treacherous floating world on the brink of war. Or maybe try Realm's horror comedy Black Friday, about literal hellspawn taking over a big box store on the eve of the biggest shopping day of the year, starring Fred Armisen. You can find both shows right now wherever you get your podcasts. Until next time, whatever dimension you're in, safe travels.
You're listening to Tales Beyond Time, created and produced by Realm, your portal to another world. Listen away. Tales Beyond Time, Episode 11, features The Queen's Garden, written by Kate Elliot. It is produced by Mary Asadolahi and Marco Palmieri, associate produced by Alexis Latshaw, and executive produced by Molly Barton, hosted by Marco Palmieri, and performed by Rachel Fulginiti. Audio produced by Tie Def Studios. Additional editing by Nicholas Papaleo. Cover art by Kendall Thomas.